So Darren, thank you for doing this interview in advance of our event, Cambridge Analytica and the Future of Social Media. We're really interested to get your perspective as a lawmaker and a politician to the topic of potential regulation of social media platforms. The recent Cambridge Analytica story has thrown into question the integrity of elections around the world due to the potential of questionably obtained Facebook data being used for targeted political advertising. What are your thoughts on this issue?
Well, look, firstly, sorry that I can't be with you this evening because of changes in the agenda in the House of Commons. I wasn't able to be with you in person. I'm sorry not to be here. The Cambridge Analytica issue has raised this debate in the public, I think for the first time. Lots of us have been having these conversations for a long time, actually, but this is the first time it's become a big public issue, which I think is important and good. In terms of the impact on elections, I think there's two sides to the coin. I think one side, it's right to say that people aren't stupid. I mean, they will still make up their decision on how they want to vote. It's not for government to regulate the processes through which people make democratic decisions. But I think it's right to say that people have been uneasy about the way in which Cambridge Analytica and others have tried to tap into our innermost emotions and fears and prejudices to subliminally influence us. And so there has to be an answer to that, and I think broadly that has to be about honest advertising in political campaigns, regulating online in the same way that we might do in broadcast media or in the newspapers, and allowing people to verify facts as opposed to opinions so that they can make an informed decision as opposed to just having what is often the case, a load of rubbish coming up on your feed.
Since this rose up the news agenda, there have been increasing calls in the US to regulate social media platforms on data protection issues, but also other issues such as extremist content and the spread of disinformation. Do you think there is a role for the government here in the UK to regulate social media platforms?
So I think they're two slightly different questions. Social media platforms are already regulated in certain ways, but to go to the first point, I think there's a really interesting geopolitical conversation about regulation of the internet. So if you look at Russia, China, clearly there is a very nationalistic, data sovereignty, state influence perspective to their policy. You come across to Europe, Germany is a bit tougher than the UK and has kind of led some of the tougher moves under European laws in recent years around, for example, if you don't remove extremist content from your platform, you can be fined now by the German government. And that doesn't currently happen here in the UK, although the government has debated it. And then you go across to the US and basically you do whatever you like. And so there's this interesting kind of spectrum of different approaches. I think it's good that the US is looking to us in Europe, and Britain's had a really important role to play in devising European legislation in this space to see how we do it better. But ultimately we need to try and build as global a consensus as possible because these are global platforms.
Do you think there should be regulation therefore in things like disinformation campaigns, or do you think platforms like Facebook have a responsibility to verify the adverts that they publish because they are an advertising platform, are actually telling the right information like you would have in the offline world? You have adverts going through a regulator.
I think that's kind of where we need to get to. I mean, the platform companies will say, of course, that they're just a place for people to be able to put stuff. They're not publishers of information, so they're not subject to existing regulation on that space. That argument is a bit thin now, and what I don't want to do is over-regulate, but there does need to be a regulatory answer somewhere in the middle of those two aspects. And we need to have a debate now about how we're going to do that. But as I say, that can't just be kind of Britain going it alone. It needs to be Britain as part of the European Union and in whatever relationship we have with them, in the next couple of years, but also in partnership with the US as well.
So if there were to be some regulation down the road, do you think it should be led by Parliament itself, or do you think it should be outsourced to an external body like Ofcom or the Electoral Commission?
So Parliament isn't very good at this stuff. I often describe the House of Commons like going into a sausage-making factory. If you look at the way legislation is done on the floor of the House, in my view, it's not great at detail, right? It's good at principles, but not very good at detail. So it needs to be both Parliament, if there needs to be a statutory responsibility for regulators to do more work, but ultimately Ofcom, the Information Commissioner, need to be able to do the detailed work because they know the area the best. There is a question about whether there needs to be another regulator for the internet. I partly agree with that, but I'm not quite clear about how it fits with communications regulation and Ofcom and data regulation in the ICO. So again, those are the types of principles that we need to explore more in Parliament, but I wouldn't want us getting into the detail of how to do it because it would just end up in a right mess.
And do you think that there's a risk that any type of regulation would actually benefit the larger companies like Facebook and Google who can afford to pay lobbyists and really get into the detail of regulation, whereas startup companies just won't have that capacity?
Maybe. I mean, an interesting observation from my perspective is you compare the tech companies to perhaps the old school utilities, they have much, much smaller lobbying teams in-house. And actually, Facebook, for example, has I know the head of the kind of policy outfit, primarily because he used to work for the Labour Party, but I've never met anyone else, I've never been there, they don't send me stuff. They're a bit laissez-faire in their lobbying, right? I think they're going to have to get much better at that. But ultimately, I think consumers, I think they want us to do it for them. I might be wrong, I don't want to sound patronising, but you compare it to, for example, the regulation of broadband. No one really cares how broadband works. No one really reads their terms and conditions, but they know that there are regulators mandated by government to look out for consumers. And I kind of think that's where people want us to end up. So by taking that regulatory approach, we will create the right balance between consumers and often small businesses against the big corporates.
So the rise of online abuse, particularly towards politicians, is vile and can turn people away from wanting to get involved in politics. Is this something you think social media platforms should take more responsibility over, or do you think it's a wider social issue and something that politicians will have to put up with in the short term?
It's a very complicated policy kind of answer to that. I mean, there's the theory that what the rules are and how they apply in the offline world should apply in the online world, and I agree with that, right? Some people conduct themselves online in wholly inappropriate ways, in ways that they wouldn't do offline. There needs to be enforcement and legal consequences, I think, for online harassment or abuse in the same way that it would be offline, and that needs to be dealt with in the right way. Parliament and the police have got better at doing that on behalf of politicians in recent years. But also there needs to be this kind of ethical debate, which we've not had yet, which is, well, if people feel like they can be anonymous online, and maybe that's okay because of privacy concerns, actually how do you regulate, if at all, the kind of rules of the game online? It's still kind of a wild west. From my perspective as well, I mean, I get very little abuse online, but I know that, for example, some of my female colleagues get tons of abuse, and there's huge gender imbalances around abuse online, which is fueled by societal prejudices that people feel able to bring out because they're anonymous and there's no consequences, and we kind of need to have a better conversation around anonymity and consequences of unacceptable behaviour.
Do you think that there should be a role for the government to focus on digital literacy education in schools for young people, but also for adults as well, and how to use the internet appropriately and safely, because often it can feel like these are just like a sticky plaster on social media platforms, whereas it's quite a wider social issue of human behaviour.
Yeah, I mean, the government's answer to that would be that they've got the digital charter, which looks at some of these things. I mean, if I'm being honest and a bit critical, the digital charter feels like the government's doing something because they feel they have to do something, but it's not actually doing anything, which I think is a shame. There needs to be much more investment in digital skills, but also in public understanding around how digital and technology products and services work. So when you think about trying to build consumer trust or empowering consumers to take decisions about their privacy, they need to know how the thing works in the first place in order to take that action, and we need to do much more work on that. The government, understandably and rightly, also focuses on young people in schools and further in higher education, and that's right, but we must also remember that older people who are in the education system would benefit from this as well, not least those who will have to reskill when they lose jobs. For example, the obvious one is the taxi driver and the autonomous vehicle.
So what would you say are the top two main issues to consider for policymakers or think tankers or researchers or members of the public when approaching the subject of government regulation of the internet?
I think the key word for me is it has to be effective regulation, because we can talk endlessly in the House of Commons about the big issues. And actually, when we do talk about digital and tech issues in the House of Commons, it's normally pretty quiet. There's not many MPs that engage in this debate, it has to be said. There's the usual suspects. So there's an upskilling, or that we need to do probably in the House of Commons as well. The Lords, it's actually pretty good, with their recent report on artificial intelligence, for example. But Parliament as a whole needs to get better at this. And in doing so, it needs to think about how do we effectively regulate. Not over-regulate because we're scared or we think there's these big issues we need to stop, but effectively regulate, which allows for Britain to remain as a strength in the digital market in the world, but also has a consumer-focused protection angle, which, as I say, I think consumers would like us to be more proactive on.
Okay. Thank you, Darren.
Pleasure.